Welcome to the Homegrown podcast. I'm your host, Liz Hazelmeyer, and here we aim to educate, inspire, and equip you in your pursuit of true nourishment. We do that in a couple ways. We love having guests on the podcast, like last week's episode with Molly Englehart, who really inspire us and challenge us to think of maybe different perspectives that we wouldn't have been even introduced to. We have experts on the show all the time, doctors, physicians, holistic practitioners, all sorts of people. And then we also share like real food philosophy and real food stories of both our own experiences and of those in the community. And we love doing that. And so today's episode, we are going to be talking about what I'm going to call like real food apologetics. And I use that term very ironically and intentionally because our food philosophies can sometimes feel like a religion. And I don't think that's good. I don't think that's healthy. I think, though, that in this very politicized health culture that we're currently living in, a lot of us do feel a need to sort of have like our ducks in a row and have like an explanation as to why we might be pursuing a real food journey or why we might be choosing to consume one food over the other. And, that begs the question of like, why do we even care? Why do we care what other people think about the food that we're feeding our family? But the truth is, sometimes it's nice to have a couple arguments just like in your back pocket. And I don't mean arguments in terms of like fighting with people, but I just mean educated responses or informed decision making. Sometimes that can give us more confidence in our own real food journey if we understand why we are consuming the foods we're consuming. Sometimes it's nice to know these little snippets of information or to have food like painted through a certain lens so that we are assured that we're not just following some trend blindly, but that we really believe in the food that we are feeding our families and the results of this sort of whole food, real food lifestyle. So, real food apologetics. It might be the title of the show, it might not be, but that's kind of how I'm going to structure today's episode. Obviously, my co-host, my husband, Joey, is not with me today. It's just me. And that's okay. This is going to be like a one-on-one sit down, like we're chatting, we're having coffee. I want to give you sort of the way that I think about these things now, having been in the real food game for over a decade, having had many conversations with folks in the food industry, farmers, ranchers, people who produce foods, and then also kind of blending that with my realistic take on how I'm going to feed my family well. And, I believe the food choices that we make every single day have greater impact. And I think that if I'm going to hold such a strong stance on something, I want to have a little bit of a background or a reason to feel confident in my decision making. So that is how we are going to structure today's episode. Before we dive in, I want to talk about just a little hint back to last week's episode 2 with Molly Englehart, where she is discussing why some of our food choices are so politicized. And from her perspective, a lot of it is because we have this disconnection to nature. We are so far removed from our food source and nature itself that we can believe the lies that a lot of times our modern food culture is telling us. And in her example, as a former vegan, she believed the lie that there was less death on her vegan plate than there would be on a plate with, say, meat and eggs and, animal byproduct. And if you haven't listened to that conversation, I encourage you to go back and listen. But I think it's just a great example and a great overarching theme, and that our disconnection from nature allows us to kind of stay confused. And as a response, we should turn to nature to get some of those answers. And so today's podcast sponsor really fits the build, and it really has created this ability to return to nature in terms of whole food supplementation, and that is ancestral supplements. You guys have heard me talk about them, and you'll continue to hear me talk about them because we're using it in our home every day. Ancestral supplements have a wide variety of products that are organ-based, and they're using regeneratively sourced cattle from New Zealand. They're third-party lab testing for purity, so there's not going to be heavy heavy metals in their products, and they have a 60-day money back guarantee. And to me, that's like the trifecta, right? Is like, if I can find something that fills a nutritional gap that I might have, because I am living this modern lifestyle, and I'm, if I'm being honest, I'm not getting my weekly dose of organs every day, or every week rather, then a supplementation on a daily basis might do the trick. So I love Ancestral Supplements. I've been buying from them since 2021 and been a loyal customer ever since. Luckily, they give this community a very large discount, 15% off. So go check out their website. I said this on a previous show. I'll say it again. They have so much to offer. They have bone broth based protein powder. They've got digestive enzymes. They have just your standard desiccated liver supplement, but then they've got special formulas for both men and women. And so check that out. Read the description. See if you find something that might meet a need that you have, and make sure you use the code Homegrown at checkout to get 15% off. So like I said, head over to ancestralsupplements.com. You can /homegrown, take you straight to the page and browse the product. Use that code and get yourself 15% off. Okay, now that we are going to dive into the conversation of real food apologetics, or, whatever other phrase you want to use, I want us to remember that there are some of us that, we couldn't give a rip about what other people think about what we're doing in our own home and what we're feeding our family. And to those people, I say, congratulations, you have made it. you have bypassed the society's tendency to, argue about silly everyday choices. But there are a lot of us, as I said earlier in the show, that even though we're confident in our decision, sometimes it's just nice to hear, like, again, it positioned in a way that you're like, okay, yeah, no, this is common sense. Like, okay, I am, this is why I believe in this. It's not just because I saw someone say it online. And so today's episode is going to be just that. So I have notes here, and I want to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 bullet points here, and I'm going to try to only spend 5 minutes on each bullet point. Okay. We're going to be snappy here, because here's the reason. You probably don't have time to dive into like an hour-long discussion with someone if food does come up and if someone is asking you questions. So let's just get straight to the point. So the very first kind of controversial real food that I will defend is raw milk, because raw milk is where I started. And if you're not familiar with my story, we joined the real food movement through raw milk because we had to make infant formula for our baby at the time. And so, wow, gosh, is that like a really intense way to enter the movement? Yeah, I would say so. And so I had to equip myself with lots of knowledge and understanding to sort of back my own argument when inevitably friends and family would ask me, what the heck are you doing? What do you mean you're making your own raw milk formula? That's insane. And so I joined that kind of movement 8 or so years ago, and raw milk was the first thing that really opened up my eyes to just how political the landscape is of real food, and how really when you look at food via the lens of history, it removes a lot of that. It removes a lot of the sort of like agenda stuff that we can see going on, and paints a better picture. So the way I want you to think about the foods that I'm bringing up today and sort of defending, I'm going to keep coming back to this, is think about how you would eat if the grocery store was not selling food. Okay. So if the grocery store was not selling food and you wanted to get milk, what would you do? Well, you'd either go to your local farm that's hopefully not too far away, or you'd go back out to your cow and you'd milk that lactating mama, and you would have whole, rich milk. You wouldn't have any of the fat removed. It would have a cream top. So once it kind of cooled and settled, the cream would rise to the top. It would have all of its enzymes still active. It would have all of its proteins still in their whole form, and the fat would not be split up into a million different pieces because it wouldn't have undergone this treatment called homogenization. And you would consume that milk very fresh. It would be raw, inevitably. And if you don't have refrigeration, then you would ferment it and you would turn it into another byproduct like cheese or yogurt or kefir or some sort of clabbered milk. And that's how you would consume dairy and milk if the grocery store wasn't there. And so yes, that seems like a silly little illustration, maybe, but if you really think about why raw milk is so contested by the larger government and larger dairy industry, it is because we have this middleman. We have this retailer who needs to disperse our food, right? And so you have to go to the grocery store and buy something off the shelf, and you have to have it guaranteed that on its very long journey from the farm to you, nothing has happened to it. And so the best way to make that guarantee is to render that food sterile, completely sterilize it. And that is what pasteurization is. If you look at Louis Pasteur, the man who invented pasteurization, he first got his sort of name known in the French wine industry when they were trying to make wine last longer. It was kind of decomposing naturally too soon, and they wanted to like expand their trade and transport it further, and they didn't really have a good way to do that. So for a time period, they like experimented with pasteurization. Now, since then, the wine industry does not pasteurize their wine, and they have gone away from that process. But that was the first kind of moment in Pasteur's life where he realized that the heat treatment of a liquid can sort of sterilize it and then therefore lengthen its shelf life. And so when we were doing this big migration from a more agrarian culture to these larger cities, and people were bringing their cows with them, and now we're all kind of confined together, and there's a lot of illness and not so great sanitation, and now we have an issue where the milk that is being consumed is a vector for illness and bacteria. It needs to be rendered sterile because it is dirty. It is coming from unhealthy environments, unhealthy animals. It can kill you. Okay. That is a real reality of unclean milk. And so this time period, which is in, the late 1800s, where Pasteur really reigned, is it was a answer to a very real problem. But today, in today's culture, we have things like a better understanding of sanitation. We have testing mechanisms for cow illnesses like tuberculosis. We have a better understanding of transport. We've got refrigeration. We can do all of these things that would mitigate our risk of consuming a whole real food. And so with raw milk specifically, it's funny because nobody is saying that milk is inherently dangerous. The CDC does not say that. The FDA does not say that. No government entity is telling you that milk from an udder is dangerous. Rather, it is the possibility of that milk being contaminated with a foodborne bacteria, something that can really cause illness like a listeria or a certain strain of E. coli. There are all sorts of common strains of these bacteria and viruses that, of course, if they are introduced into a living whole food, they have the ability to procreate, to multiply, and therefore make humans sick, whoever might consume that. Now, I often hear people say, well, I don't really like sit down with a glass of milk that often. So is it really worth it to have raw milk? And in that instance, I would encourage you to look at dairy, or at least look for dairy in the grocery store in its most natural form. So if you're going to get a sour cream, get one that's just cultured cream and maybe some added in like bacterial strands or enzymes and nothing else. Okay. If you're going to get a kefir, can you find one that is at least minimal ingredients if you can't get it raw off the shelf? And so the whole category of dairy and raw dairy again takes us back to like, what could you make in your own kitchen? What ingredients would be readily available to you? And with milk being such a pervasive ingredient, I mean, think about all of the things that stem from milk. We have just regular cream, we have buttermilk, we have cottage cheese, all types of regular cheese, sour cream. We have yogurts and kefirs, and you can do all sorts of like fermented items with the whey that comes from milk. I mean, milk is really such a diverse ingredient. And so when people want to rule out all dairy, I often encourage them to look at raw dairy and kind of just go back to the roots of what dairy used to be consumed as in this country. And again, looking back at the history can help paint a really clear picture. I do have a free raw dairy guide that basically gives a really good summary of the history of milk, why it became pasteurized in the first place, a whole breakdown on where to source raw dairy if that's your thing, if that's what you're looking for. So go over to homegrowneducation.org. It's under the shop page and you can find it. It's free, 100% free. You don't have to pay a dime for it. It's great. It's a great resource. Again, it will help build some of that confidence that you will have going forward when you are talking about your health decisions, or maybe encouraging a friend to do so, or honestly, just for your own sanity. The next hot topic that I sort of want to defend is red meat. And again, I'm going to ask us, how would we eat if the grocery store wasn't selling food? So for me, in Ohio, without access to a local stream or pond where I could fish, I would be mostly eating red meat in the form of venison. I mean, I live, in the suburbs, in the woods, there's deer all around me. And so red meat in and of itself is probably what would make up my main protein source. Now, if you're on like the coast and you're like fish all day, or you're in a place where there are a lot of fowl that you would be consuming on a regular basis, awesome. But let's drop the notion that walking into a grocery store and picking up a package of ground beef versus a package of chicken. Let's drop the notion that the chicken is the cleaner meat, because we've been fed this lie, and it really stems from this sort of low fat propaganda that we have been given. And it's that animal fats and animal proteins, particularly red meat, can be bad for us and that we should avoid them at all costs. And instead, what I would encourage you to do is look at the resource Sacred Cow. It's both a book and a documentary. One of the authors, Diana Rogers, we actually had on the show several years ago, so you can go listen to that episode. And then we did another episode, just me and Joey, titled A Case for Beef. And in those episodes, we talk about this very nuanced conversation of, if you're buying food from a grocery store, actually the cleaner meat in this instance is beef. And here's why. Chicken and pork primarily are raised in CAFOs in the United States, these centralized animal feeding operations, okay? These horrific, very enclosed, small quarters, poor sanitation, poor overall wellness environments that these animals, these pigs and these chickens, are being bred in for the consumption of humans. So in those situations, they're being fed a lot of grain, a lot of GMO corn, soy, and alfalfa. And it just does not make for a superior protein product. I will say, though, however, if it is the best you can do, it's the best you can do. It's still animal source protein. But this idea that beef, specifically red meat, right? And most of us think of beef when we think of red meat. This idea that red meat is the epitome of just gluttony and it is not a health food has really been challenged recently. And it's because of folks like Diana Rogers, who are coming out and explaining that actually red meat is far more than just protein. There's tons of micronutrients in it, great heme iron. There's all kinds of wonderful benefits from consuming a very red meat rich diet. Also, if you think about the amount that a cow can feed versus, or even like a deer can feed your family versus one chicken's like one meal. So you talk about the sustainability aspect of it. You talk about the life aspect of it. Okay. Taking the life of one cow can probably yield like 300 pounds of edible food versus having to kill maybe 20 chickens, and that's like 1 month of food, right? And so thinking in terms of sort of that back to nature concept, how would we eat if we weren't walking into the grocery store and picking these things up in their saran wrapped form? So, this idea that red meat is the cause of cancer and heart disease, all of those really stems from some shoddy research done by Ansel Keys and others. And it again goes back to this idea of cholesterol, this dietary cholesterol and our fear. And so I'm going to kind of group this defense of red meat in with my defense of fats because they really go hand in hand. And you see a lot of times there's all kinds of heat on seed oils in in the online space, and also just you'll hear like anyone off the street now, like if they're hip at all, they'll be like, oh yeah, the seed oils, stay away from those. And while I agree with that notion, I'm not sure how many people understand why. So that's what we're going to get into. So there's a big difference between a fat that can be rendered from an animal. So you're talking about like a tallow, a ghee from butter, or butter itself, lard, which would be fat from pigs, any sort of poultry fat, chicken, goose fat, all these things. Huge difference between that and something that is going to be squeezed out of a seed or in some cases a nut. And so the problem that people have with seed oils is not that they are inherently just inedible foods in their whole form. It's that the process to extract the fat is so challenging that it requires heavy machinery, heavy inputs, oftentimes the use of harsh chemicals like hexane to extract these things. So the way I like to think about it is the easier that fat is rendered from its whole natural source, the healthier it is. So if you think about coconut oil or avocado oil or olive oil, right, where we're simply just pressing these fruits and extracting the oil, and it might go through a filter, it might not, but that's it. Like you could basically do that in your kitchen. And then you think again about these animal fats where we are just taking the literal fat of the animal and cutting it out. Maybe we're rendering that by heating it and getting it nice and congealed, and maybe filtering that as well. Those processes can literally be done on your stove. They can be done with simple material. They can be done with low pressure. There's not a lot that is involved. And so that in and of itself is what we're looking for when we're looking for healthy fat. The other issue with these fats that come from seeds like the canola or the rapeseed plant, or you're looking at corn oil or soy oil or rice bran oil, all these little seed oils. The issue is they tend to be very high in omega-6 fatty acids. And that becomes a problem when you consider the amount of heat used to extract these oils, because the omega-6 fatty acids are very volatile. They can oxidize quickly, and you do not want your oil to oxidize. You don't want it to go rancid. You don't want it to be unstable. You want it to be saturated, actually, which is funny because the very demonized fat for its molecular structure is the oil, the fat that we are looking for. So what happens is when we consume these oils that are highly rancid, they've been oxidized already in the process of mere extraction, then they enter our body, which is a cool 98 degrees, and continue oxidation can happen. And that's where we see all kinds of issues of, immune response and things being so small they're entering into the bloodstream. There's just a lot in terms of these manufactured oils that were really meant to be utilized in maybe like the automotive industry and not so much our food. So there is a great resource. Dr. Kate Shanahan wrote a book called Deep Nutrition, and she goes deep into the subject of fats. So if you want to go even deeper into that, and again, that circles back into this notion that red meat is somehow bad for us. And then again, I would ask the question, how would we be eating if we are not picking things out of packages off the grocery store shelves? Okay. The next food in defense is sourdough. And while this might be kind of an interesting one, it is definitely a trendy one. And so for those who believe wholeheartedly in sourdough, you might be wondering, well, yeah, why am I so into it? Is it just because it looks cute on the squares of Instagram, or does it actually have any benefit? And I'm happily here to tell you that it has immense benefit. So You don't have to go to the grocery store and pick up that little yellow packet of yeast. You actually can cultivate wild yeast in your environment, wild yeast that lives in the flour already, along with lactic acid bacteria, and create a starter culture. And from there, you can leaven any baked good. Any baked good. This stuff is so genius. It's as if this is how we were designed to eat. I mean, really, like you just mix water and flour over a period of time, and you have this beautiful living organism that can literally make bread rise. The other benefit of sourdough, not only are you not having to buy commercial yeast, but you are also benefiting from the long form fermentation that's happening. So what happens when you use traditional yeast like that you would find in the grocery store, or commercial yeast, I should say, is you're getting some of that fermentation because you have the yeast aspect, but you don't have the bacteria aspect. And so it's really kind of a cheated process. And you're only getting like one strain of yeast there. You're getting whatever they have decided makes the bread rise the best. And instead, you are missing out on this very complex process of yeast and bacteria sort of living symbiotically and working together to create both rich flavor, but also a natural rise. And so the fermentation process also does this interesting thing where we sort of build up gluten in the sourdough process. You'll hear that term a lot, like, is your gluten strong? How's your dough strength? Are you using a high gluten flour? But then as the fermentation takes place over 18 hours or 24 hours total, that gluten is actually becoming weakened and sort of pre-digested, so that by the time it goes into the oven, it is in a perfectly ideal state to be strong enough to hold up and form those nice big air pockets and bubbles, but pre-digested enough for our body to be able to assimilate those nutrients. That fermentation process also cuts down on a lot of the anti-nutrients found in wheat. If you think about it, again, seeds and nuts and grains, all of these things are designed to sprout new life, but they have to have a protective mechanism, because they don't just want to sprout when ideal circumstances are not present. They want to make sure that they have the right sunlight, the right moisture content, the right temperature. They want to make sure that this living being that's going to come out of this seed is going to thrive. And so there's a lot of outer coating on things like wheats and oats and grains of those sorts that help protect that little seed. And it's a wonderful protective mechanism. And the problem is when we as humans go eat that seed raw or unfermented, then we are then having to do all this hard work of like stripping that outer layer. And there's a lot in there, and it can be really hard on our guts. And so when you hear people say things like, oh man, I can't eat that, it makes me feel terrible, you have to ask a lot of questions like, okay, well, what form was the wheat in when you consumed it? Was it fermented? Was it given that time to really break down and become this easily digestible food? Was that wheat ever sprayed by like desiccated with a harsh chemical like glyphosate? Was that wheat a traditional breed, a traditional variety, or has it been almost manufactured to be this more modern wheat so that it is hard for our body to recognize? And yeah, I could see why your immune system would kind of tick up when you consume that food. So these are the questions you have to ask. And this is why sourdough is so interesting. And I think that there's a couple camps on it. And I think sometimes people get frustrated because it is a bit of a trend. And so they feel like, well, if I'm going to be into sourdough, man, I need to like do everything. I need to make the sourdough cinnamon rolls, and I need to have like gorgeous baked goods like on a daily basis and keep up with the Joneses. And I'm here to tell you, you don't need to do that. You don't need to feed your starter every day. You don't even need to bake every day. What I do is I leave my starter in the fridge. I pull it out when I want to bake with it. I give it a nice good feeding, a high ratio feeding, meaning very little starter to start with, a lot of fresh flour, a lot of fresh water, plenty of time for that starter to then peak and bubble and get nice and marshmallowy. And then I use almost all of that starter. So I might be baking a loaf of bread and a pizza and starting a cookie dough. And then I put the jar with just the scrapes along the side inside my fridge, and I just keep it there until I'm ready to use it again. And I think folks who have kind of bailed on the sourdough movement because they're so frustrated by the upkeep would be relieved to know that you don't have to have this long, crazy process behind it, and that it can be a very low key, very sort of spontaneous thing. It's funny. I was actually laughing the other day. I've never baked with traditional yeast. It intimidates me. I'm like, I don't understand how I just like pour this packet and like it's supposed to bloom in warm water and then it's going to rise my dough in like 45 minutes. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. But sourdough, I can get on board with. Like I know how to tweak it for a faster fermentation or a longer fermentation. And I know how to like sort of rough it when it comes to planning. Like, oh shoot, I think I want to bake a loaf in about 12 hours. Like, do I have time? Yeah, I could rush that. And it's so opposite of probably most people's experiences. But that's just to show you, like, even someone very kind of quote unorganized as me in the kitchen can embrace something as traditional and rhythmic as sourdough without letting it overwhelm me. So I'm a huge fan of sourdough because one, it's a nod to every other person that's baked bread before me. Two, it's better for me from a digestive and nutritional stance. And three, it is something that gives me so much confidence in the kitchen. It's fun, it's experimental, it's exciting. So I'm very into that. Um, I did the sort of fats and meats thing all together. And so the final thing I want to defend, right, in our sort of apologetics style podcast here is this idea that organic is a marketing ploy. And we've actually done a whole podcast on this. And I think even since recording that, my kind of stance has had even more depth to it. So I think number one, the conversation of organic food really needs to be broken into which types of food you're buying organic. Are we talking about organic produce, or are we talking about organic packaged goods like crackers and pasta and chips and things like that? Or are we talking about organically raised meat and organic eggs? Like, are we talking about animal byproduct? Are we talking about fruits and vegetables? Or are we talking about foods that have been made with organic ingredients, therefore are organic certified, box of crackers? And so my answer to this kind of is different for each of those categories. So I'll start with the easiest and most straightforward, and that's that organic, as it applies to fruits and vegetables, is absolutely an agricultural term and is not a marketing ploy. Organic, it dictates what those farmers can use on their land. It dictates what those farmers can use in harvesting. And so there are rules and regulations around what organic farming can and cannot do. And so I'm not here to say it's perfect. A lot of people, will poke holes at it, which I sympathize with. I understand that it's when you're raising food in this industrial complex model, it's not going to be perfect. But if there's a version of a fruit or a vegetable that isn't allowed to be sprayed with any synthetic herbicides or pesticides, that's the one I'm reaching for. Now, it's not always accessible. I had to buy conventional raspberries the other week because I was like, I need berries for this birthday thing and this Valentine's Day thing, and they had zero organic. And the thought process that I had was, well, I'm pretty sure that this company that creates these raspberries has gone mostly hydroponic farming anyways. And so if we're talking about an indoor growing environment, am I concerned that these conventional raspberries are being highly sprayed? That might be a wrong assumption on my part. I might not understand. I haven't toured this facility, so I don't know for sure. But I'm telling you as the listener, that was my thought process of like, well, if they're hydroponically grown, which, people are upset that that's even allowed in organics, but if they're conventional and they're hydroponic, and so I'm going to assume they have to use less, external inputs because they have a pretty controlled environment already, then I wouldn't be so scared about like consuming this conventional raspberry. Not that I'm ever scared of consuming conventional produce, but I'm just saying that was my thought process. Now, when we're talking about organic animal products, this gets a little bit more nuanced because, again, milk is a great example. Organic milk from the grocery store is going to be ultra pasteurized, ultra high temp pasteurized, UHT. And the reason for that is because there's so much fewer organic dairies, that milk has to travel much farther to get to your store. And so in order to travel that far, it needs to last that long. And so believe it or not, UHT milk could sit just in the center aisles. It doesn't even need to be refrigerated because it is a 100% sterile product. But of course, they're not going to be able to sell that. So they put it in the fridge along with the other milk because you would feel safer buying milk that's chilled than buying organic milk from the center aisle. And so with organic dairy, I kind of go back and forth because, I've heard other farmers say that some of the most inhumane animal practices were witnessed on an organic dairy. And then I also know other friends who have just generational organic dairies who work really hard to care for those cows and their process. And so I don't think it's as black and white as we would like it to be. And here I think you have to go with the brand. So there are certain brands of food that I know I really trust and believe in. And then there are other brands that maybe aren't even certified organic, but I know a little bit more about that farming practice that I feel comfortable partaking in. Here's an example. I absolutely love Painterland Sisters organic skier style yogurt. I love them. We've had them on the podcast. They're fourth generation organic dairy and they're wonderful. And I love their mission. I love their story. I love their work ethic. I love their product. I also love Kelowna Supernatural's or Beyond Organic milk, right? If you have to get store milk, like milk from the grocery store and it can't be raw, and it's low temp pasteurized, non-homogenized, it's a great alternative. I love their stuff. There are other brands though of low temp pasteurized, non-homogenized milk that aren't quote certified organic that are more local to me. So am I going to completely write them off because they haven't paid for the certification to be organic? No, I'm going to learn more about them. So I go on an animal base, brand by brand. And I guess I kind of did that with the fruits and vegetables with my raspberry example. And then the organic question as it comes to packaged products. This one, I sympathize with those who say marketing organic is a marketing ploy because I understand where you could come to that assumption. I think the box of organic crackers, chips, candy is still crackers, chips, and candy. Now, here's where I draw the line. If I know that the product I'm buying is wheat-based or grain-based, and I know that those particular crops have heavier inputs of certain things I really want to avoid in my family, I will opt for the organic version. Okay. I just made my dad go to 2 different grocery stores to pick up 4 boxes of organic crackers because we couldn't find them at ours. I'm not even joking. So, that instance, I'm happy to pay for the organic box of crackers, which keep in mind was only $3.29. It wasn't like breaking the bank. But if you're going to buy like an organic candy that's like very luxurious and expensive, are you paying more for that because it's also a premium packaged good? Yes, it's not just because it's an organic certified product, but then also keep in mind that that creator of that food had to then source everything certified organic, which means that the label and the weight that holds monetarily, every single person involved had to pay a little bit of. It's almost like every single person was taxed in that process to then lead to the end result of you being able to go to the grocery store and pick up your organic animal crackers. It's going to be a little bit more expensive. And I think the part where I sympathize with calling it a ploy is just when people see the word organic and think it's healthy. And this is something we've talked about before, where obviously that's not the case. Obviously, organic means a certain set of guidelines. No synthetic pesticides were used, no biosolids were sprayed on the land that was cultivating that particular crop. You can't have antibiotics as it relates to animal products, no hormone growth use, things like that. There are real hard definitions to what the organic label means, but where people get frustrated is when you see the word organic and assume it is some sort of now health food or better for me thing. So again, that goes back to what your values are. Are you willing to shop for the organic crackers and just hold off until you can get them? Or is it something where you're like, you know what? It's a cracker. It's maybe like 1% of my diet. I'm just going to pick the best thing I can have. I can see both sides to that. So I totally understand that. I do want to hold on to the fact that organic holds a lot of weight in animal agriculture and in the production of fruits and vegetables, though. So that kind of wraps up my sort of like defense of the real food movement. And the way I would define real food in our household is just as close to nature as you can get. We are a hunting family, so we eat a lot of wild game. We eat a lot of red meat because it is what's most accessible to us in our area. We also, we get milk from a local farm, so we're consuming raw dairy, raw yogurt, raw milk. And we buy organic produce when possible. By no means do you have to adopt the exact same food philosophy that we have in our household, but I would encourage you to ponder what your food philosophy is and the arguments behind it. And if this is something where you really want to go more in depth, I actually have a resource titled The Real Food Framework that does exactly that. Breaks down what looking at food through a historical lens does and where that would lead you and point you in terms of looking for food that's most nutritious for your family, how to source food, how to meal plan, how to grocery shop on a budget, all of this sort of like ideological, philosophical understanding around food and nourishment is wrapped up in this one resource that is, again, available on homegrowneducation.org. And I don't even think I mentioned the free sourdough guide. So you guys go check it out because it's over there on the website, free for your taking. Again, I do want to say thank you to our podcast sponsors, Ancestral Supplements. This is a company that has really partnered with us because we are using their products every day and they are allowing us to pursue the health goals that we want. I want to be able to be really strong and nourished, especially in my current stage of mothering 4 kids and running a podcast and, attempting to learn archery, right? I have all of these big goals that I have that I need to get fuel for. So every day am taking their collagen, I'm taking their fem enhancement product, I'm utilizing their protein powder. And it's such a wonderful benefit to my life. And so we're super excited to share them with the homegrown audience. Go to ancestralsupplements.com/homegrown and you can read more about the specific supplement. Again, look for something that might be filling in a gap. If you're having digestive issues, like they've got enzymes for you. If you're like really low in minerals, they have a mineral supplement. And all of their stuff is sourced with such integrity and third-party lab tested that I feel really secure and comfortable using it. You can use the discount code homegrown to get 15% off your order, which is amazing. And they have a 60-day money back guarantee. So go check them out, ancestralsupplements.com/homegrown. And if you're looking for any of the resources that I mentioned today, either the free dairy guide or the free sourdough guide or that real food framework, hop over to homegrowneducation.org and check it out. We also have a home goods shop that we source really amazing products because we want to continue this sort of conscientious consumer. And so many of our audience members are right there with us in that we want to buy things that are both good for us, good for our family, good for the environment. And so you can find amazing coffee and tea over there, handmade ceramic mugs, small batch lard dish soap, which I'm obsessed with. Horsehair dish brushes. I mean, it's a wide variety, but you can check it all out at shoptheage.com. And until next time.